Scene 4. It is late at night. The terrace of the White Villa. The watchman, Rudy, sweeps the audience with the beam of his flashlight. We hear a long, anguished ah from behind the screen masking Mrs. Goforth's bed. Rudy, as if he heard the outcry, turns the flashlight momentarily on the screen behind which it comes. He chuckles, sways drunkenly, then suddenly turns the light beam on Chris, who has entered quietly from the wings, stage right. Chris, shielding his eyes from the flashlight. Oh, hello. Rudy. You still prowling around here? Chris, agreeably. No, well, yes, His smile fades as Rudy moves in closer. I just now woke up hungry. I didn't want to disturb anybody, Rudy, you just now woke up, huh? Chris, yes, Rudy, where'd you just now wake up? Chris, in the guest house. Rudy, looking for the dogs again, are you? He whistles the dogs awake. They set up a clamor far away. Chris, I told you I just now woke up hungry. I came out to see if Rudy, moving still closer and cutting in. Aw, you woke up hungry. Chris, yes, famished. Rudy, how about this? How'd you like to eat this? Something like this. He thrusts his stick hard into Chris's stomach. Chris expels his breath in a huh. Does that feel good on your belly? Want some more of that? Huh? Huh? He drives the stick again into Chris's stomach, so hard that Chris bends over, unable to speak. Blackie rushes onto the terrace in a dressing gown, her hair loose. Blackie. Rudy, what's going on here? The dogs, roused, are barking still at a distance. This young man is a guest of Mrs. Goforth. He's staying in the Pink Villa. Are you all right, Mr. Flanders? Chris can't speak. He leans on a section of balustrade, bent over, making a retching sound. Rudy, get off the terrace, you drunk gorilla. Rudy, grinning. He's got the dry heaves, Blackie. He woke up hungry, and he's got the dry heaves. Chris, can't catch breath. From her bed behind the griffin-crested screen, Mrs. Goforth cries out in her sleep a long, anguished ah. The dog's barking subsides gradually. The ah is repeated, and a faint light appears behind her screen. Blackie turns on Rudy fiercely. Blackie, I said get off the terrace. Now get off it. Rudy, you should have told me. Blackie, off it. Off the terrace. Rudy, overlapping Blackie's speech. You got yourself a boyfriend up here, Blackie. You should have let me know that. Blackie. Mr. Flanders, I'll take you back to your place. Chris, gasping. Is there anywhere closer I can catch my breath? She stands protectively near him as Rudy goes off the terrace, laughing. The stage assistants rush out to remove a screen masking Blackie's bed in the blue villa, indicating Blackie's bedroom. Chris straightens slowly, still gasping. The stage assistants leave. Then Chris and Blackie cross to her villino, represented only by a narrow blue-sheeted bed with a stand beside it that supports an intercom box. Blackie. Now, tell me just what happened so I can give a report to Mrs. Goforth tomorrow. Chris. The truth is, I was looking for something to eat. I've had no food for 5 days, Blackie, except some oranges that I picked on the road. And you know what the citric acid in oranges does to an empty stomach. So I woke up feeling as if I'd had a bushel of burning sawdust in my stomach. And Blackie, I had food sent to your room. You didn't find it? Chris, no. God, no. Blackie, then the cook didn't send it, or it was taken out while you were sleeping. And I'm afraid you'll have to wait till morning for something to eat. You see, The only kitchen is in Mrs. Goforth's villa. It's locked up like a bank vault till Mrs. Goforth wakes up and has it opened. Chris. How long is it till morning? Blackie. Oh my. Watch has stopped. I'm a watch-winding person, but I forgot to wind it. The sky has lightened a little, and there is the sound of church bells at a distance. Chris. The church bells are waking up on the other mountains. Blackie. Yes, it must be near morning. But morning doesn't begin on Mrs. Goforth's mountain until she sleeps off her drugs and starts pressing buttons for the sun to come up. So, Chris. What? The intercom box comes alive with a shrill electric buzz. Blackie. Oh God, she's awake, buzzing for me. Chris. Oh, then could you ask her to open the kitchen? A glass of milk. Just some milk is all I... Blackie. Mrs. Goforth isn't buzzing for morning. She's buzzing for me to take dictation and... Oh God, I don't think I can do it. I haven't slept tonight and I just couldn't take it right now. Chris, let me take it for you. Blackie. No, I'll have to answer myself. Or she'll come stumbling, raving out, and might fall off the cliff. She presses a button on the intercom box. Mrs. Goforth? Mrs. Goforth? The stage assistants remove the screen masking Mrs. Goforth's bed upstage left. We see her through the gauze curtains enclosing the bed. She pulls a cord, opening the curtains, and speaks hoarsely into a microphone. Mrs. Goforth. Blackie? It's night. Late night. Blackie. Yes, it's late, Mrs. Goforth. Mrs. Goforth. Don't answer. This is dictation. Don't interrupt me. This is clear as a vision. The death of Harlan Goforth, just now, clearly remembered, clear as a vision. It's night, late night, without sleep. He's crushing me under the awful weight of his body. Then suddenly he stops trying to make love to me. He says, Flora, I have a pain in my head, a terrible pain in my head. And silently to myself I say, thank God. But out loud I say something else. Tablets? You want your tablets? He answers with a groan of... I reach up and turn on the light and I see death in his eyes. I see. I know. He has death in his eyes and something worse in them. Terror. I see terror in his eyes. I see it. I feel it. Myself. And I get out of the bed. I get out of the bed as if escaping from quicksand. I don't look at him again. I move away from the bed. She rises from the bed, the microphone gripped in her hand. I move away from death. Terror. I don't look back. I go straight to the door onto the terrace. She moves downstage with the microphone. It's closed. I tear it open. I leave him alone with his death, his... Blackie. She's out of bed. She's going out on the... She rushes into the wings. The lights dim on the blue villa bed. Mrs. Goforth, dropping the microphone as she moves out on White Villa Terrace. I've gone out now. I'm outside. I'm on the terrace. 25 stories over the high city of Goforth. I see lights blazing under the high terrace, but not a light blazing as bright as the blaze of terror I saw in his eyes. She staggers to the edge of the forestage. Wind, cold wind, clean, release, relief, escape from... She reaches the edges of the orchestra pit. A wave crashes loudly below. I'm lost, blind, dying. I don't know where Blackie, rushing out behind her. Mrs. Goforth, don't move. You're at the edge of the cliff. Mrs. Goforth, stopping, her hands over her eyes. Blackie. She sways. Blackie rushes forward to catch her. Blackie, don't leave me alone. The stage is blacked out. Intermission. Scene 5. The scene is the terrace of the white villa the following morning. Mrs. Goforth is standing on the terrace while dictating to Blackie, who sits at a small table. Above the table and about the balustrade are cascades of Bougainvillea, coins of gold light reflected from the sea far below, flicker upon the playing area which is backed by fair sky. There has been a long reflective pause in the dictation. Mrs. Goforth stands glaring somberly out at the sea. Mrs. Goforth. Blackie, I want to begin this chapter on a more serious note. She moves around to the right of the table, then continues emphatically and loudly. Meaning of life. Blackie. Dictation? Mrs. Goforth. Not yet. Wait. Don't rush me. Repeats in a softer tone. Meaning of life. Chris appears at the far end of the terrace. He wears the samurai robe. Blackie sees him, but Mrs. Goforth doesn't. Blackie indicates by gesture that he should not approach yet. Yes, I feel this chapter ought to begin with a serious comment on the meaning of life, because, sooner or later a person's obliged to face it. Blackie. Dictating now, Mrs. Goforth? Mrs. Goforth. No. Thinking. Reflecting. I'll raise my hand when I begin the dictation. She raises a jeweled hand to demonstrate the signal that she will use. Blackie. Begin now? Chris smiles at her tone of voice. Blackie shrugs and closes her notebook, rises quietly and goes up to Chris, who lights her cigarette. Mrs. Goforth. One time at Flora's Folly, which was the name of the 16th century coach house renovated, near Paris, where I had my salon, my literary evenings, I brought up the question, what is the meaning of life? And do you know they treated it like a joke? Ha ha, very funny, sissy, can't be serious. But she was. Chris. I think she started dictating. Is there something to eat? Blackie. Black coffee and saccharine tablets. Chris. That's all? Blackie. Soon as I get a chance, I'll raid the kitchen for you. Mrs. Goforth. Almost plaintively. Why is it considered ridiculous, bad taste, mauvais goût, to seriously consider and discuss the possible meaning of life, and only stylish to assume it's just what? The stage assistants have come out of the wings. 1. Charade. Game. 2. Tossing a spangled ball to his partner. Pastime. 1. Tossing the ball back. Flora's Folly. 2. Tossing the ball back. Accident of atoms. 1. Returning ball. Resulting from indiscriminate copulation. Blackie throws her cigarette away and returns to her former position. The stage assistants withdraw. Mrs. Goforth. I've often wondered, but I've wondered more lately, meaning of life. The stage assistants reappear with a small table and 2 chairs. They wait in the wings for a moment before placing them. They then retire. Sometimes I suspect, that everything that we do is a way of thinking about it. Meaning of life and meaning of death too. What in the hell are we doing? She raises her jeweled hand. Just going from one goddamn frantic distraction to another, till finally one too many goddamn frantic distractions leads to disaster. And blackout? Eclipse of total of sun? She keeps staring out from the terrace, her head turning slowly right and left into the swimming gold light below her, murmuring to herself, nodding a little, then shaking her head a little. Her small, jeweled hands appear to be groping blindly for something. She coughs from time to time. There's fog coming in. See it over there? That fog coming in? Blackie. No, it's perfectly clear in all directions this morning. Mrs. Goforth. When I woke up this morning, I said to myself, Blackie. Dictation? Mrs. Goforth. Shut up. I said to myself, oh God, not morning again. Oh no, no, I can't bear it. But I did. I bore it. You really don't see that mist coming in out there? Blackie, closing her notebook. Mrs. Goforth, the young man in the pink villa, Mr. Flanders, is waiting out here to see you. He has on the samurai robe you gave him to wear while his clothes are being repaired, and it's very becoming to him. Mrs. Goforth, call him over. Blackie, Mr. Flanders? Mrs. Goforth, hey, samurai, bonsai. Approaching, Chris ducks under a brilliant cascade of bougainvillea vine. Blackie, you certainly had a long sleep. Chris, did I ever? Mrs. Goforth sitting. Did he ever? Ho ho. He slept round the clock, but still has romantic shadows under his eyes. There was a chorus girl in the Follies. I used to be in the Follies before my first marriage. When she'd show up with circles under her eyes, she'd say, the blackbirds kissed me last night, meaning she's been too busy to sleep that night. Ho ho. Chris, I was busy sleeping. Just sleeping. He bends over her hand. Mrs. Goforth, no, none of that stuff. Or old Georgia swamp bitches don't go in for hand kissing, but setzen sie dun. And are you coming out here for battle with that sword on? Chris, sitting. Oh, no, but I ran into a pack of wild dogs on the mountain yesterday when I climbed up here. Mrs. Goforth, yes, I heard about your little misunderstanding with the dogs. You don't seem much the worse for it. You're lucky they didn't get it. Grins wickedly. Your face. Chris, I'm sorry if it disturbed you, but their bite was worse than their bark. Mrs. Goforth, the Italians call them lupos, which means wolves. These watchdogs, they're necessary for protection of estates like this. But didn't you notice the private property sign in English and Italian and the beware of dogs sign when you started up the goat path from the highway? Chris, I don't think I noticed a reference to dogs, no. I don't remember any mention of dogs in English or Italian. Blackie, quickly. Naturally not. The beware of dogs sign was put up after Mr. Flanders' little misunderstanding with the dogs. Mrs. Goforth, Blackie, that is not so. Blackie, yes, it is so. I heard you ordering the sign put up after, just after the... Mrs. Goforth, trembling with fury. Blackie, you have work to do, don't you? Blackie, I've never taken a job that called for collusion and falsehood. Mrs. Goforth, mocking her. Oh, what virtue, what high moral character, Blackie. Chris, cutting in quickly. Mrs. Goforth, Miss Black, I obviously did enter and trespass on private property at my own risk. Mrs. Goforth, if that statement's typed up, Blackie, type it up. Would you be willing to sign it, Mr. Flanders? Chris, certainly. Yes, of course. But let me write it up in my own handwriting and sign it now. I'd hate for you to think I'd... Blackie, he was attacked again last night. Mrs. Goforth, again? By dogs? Blackie, not by dogs, by a dog. Your watchman, Rudy, attacked him because he woke up hungry and came outside to... Mrs. Goforth, rising. Blackie, get off the terrace. Blackie, I want to get off this mountain gone mad with your madness. I try to help you. I try to feel sorry for you because you're... Mrs. Goforth, what? What am I? Chris, please. He tears a page out of Blackie's notebook and speaks to her quietly. It's all right. Go in. Mrs. Goforth, What did you say to that woman? Chris. I said, you're very upset. I said, you're trembling. Mrs. Goforth. I've been up here surrounded by traitors all summer. She staggers. Ah! Chris helps her into her chair. God. Chris. Now. He scribbles rapidly on the sheet of paper. Here. I, Christopher Flanders, entered a gate marked private at my own risk and am solely responsible for a misunderstanding with dogs. Witnesses of the signature? Mrs. Goforth. Can you unscrew this bottle? She has been trying to open her codeine bottle. Chris, taking it from her and removing the cap. 1. Mrs. Goforth. 2. Thank you. Brandy on that. She indicates the liquor cart. Chris. Courvoisier? Mrs. Goforth. Remy Martin. Thank you. Chris. Welcome. He resumes his seat and smiles at her warmly. Let me hold that glass for you. She has spilled some of the brandy. Her hand is shaking so violently. Mrs. Goforth. Thank you. Ah. She draws a deep breath, recovering herself. You have nice teeth. Are they capped? Chris shakes his head, smiling. Well, you've got beautiful teeth. In that respect, nature's been favorable to you. Chris. Thank you. Mrs. Goforth. Don't thank me. Thank your dentist. She puts on lipstick, dabbing her nostrils with a bit of disposable tissue. Chris. I've never been to a dentist. Honestly not. Mrs. Goforth. Well, then thank the Lord for the calcium that you got from your mother's milk. Well, I have a pretty wonderful set of teeth myself. In fact, my teeth are so good people think they are false. But look here. She takes her large incisors between thumb and forefinger to demonstrate the firmness of their attachment. See? Not even a bridge. In my whole mouth, I've had exactly 3 fillings, which are still there, put in there 10 years ago. See them? She opens her mouth wide. This tooth here was slightly chipped when my daughter's 3rd baby struck me in the mouth with the butt of a water pistol at Murray Bay. I told my daughter that girl would turn into a problem child, and it sure as hell did. A little pocket-sized bitch getting bigger. I'm allergic to bitches, although some people regard me as one myself. Sometimes with some justification. Want some coffee, Mr. Trojan Horse guest? Chris. Thanks. Yes. Why do you call me that? A Trojan Horse guest? Mrs. Goforth. Because you've arrived here without invitation like the Trojan horse got into Troy. She rises shakily to pour him a cup of coffee from a silver urn on the smaller upstage table. While her back is turned, Chris quietly crumples a sheet from Blackie's notebook and throws it into the orchestra pit. Chris. Don't you remember our meeting and conversation at the ballet ball some years ago? Quite a few. When you asked me to come here whenever I was in Europe? Mrs. Goforth. Passports expire, and so do invitations. They've got to be renewed every couple of years. Chris. Has my invitation expired? Mrs. Goforth. Coffee. We'll see about that. That remains to be seen. Don't you smoke with your coffee? Chris. Usually, but He indicates he has no cigarettes. Mrs. Goforth smiles knowingly and opens a cigarette box on the table. How does it feel, Mrs. Goforth, to be a legend in your own lifetime? Mrs. Goforth, pleased. If that's a serious question, I'll give it a serious answer. A legend in my own lifetime. Yes, I reckon I am. Well, I had certain advantages, endowments to start with. A face people naturally noticed, and a figure that was not just sensational, but very durable, too. Some women my age, or younger, have got breasts that look like a couple of mules hanging their heads over the top rail of a fence. Touches her bosom. This is natural. Not padded, not supported, and nothing's ever been lifted. Hell, I was born between a swamp and the wrong end of the tracks in One Street, Georgia, but not even that could stop me in my tracks. Wrong side or right side or no side. Hit showbiz at 15 when a carnival show, the manager of it, saw me and dug me on that one street in One Street, Georgia. I was billed at the Dixie Doxy. Was just supposed to move my anatomy, but was smart enough to keep my tongue moving too. And the verbal comments I made on my anatomical motions while in motion were a public delight. So I breezed through showbiz like a tornado, rising from 1 week gigs in the sticks to star billing in the follies while still in the teens, ho ho. And I was still in my teens when I married Harlan Goforth. A marriage into the social register in Dunn and Bradstreet's both. Was barely out of my teens when I became his widow. Scared to make out a will, he died in estate. So everything was sent to me. Chris. Marvelous. Amazing. Mrs. Goforth. That's right. All my life was, and still is, except here lately, I'm just a little run down. Like a racehorse that's been entered in just one race too many, even for me. How do you feel about being a legend in your own lifetime? Huh? Chris. Oh, me? I don't feel like a mythological griffin with gold wings. But this strong, fresh wind's reviving me like I've had a terrific breakfast. Mrs. Goforth. Griffin? What's a griffin? Chris. A force in life that's almost stronger than death. He springs up and turns to the booming sea. The sea's full of white racehorses today. Would you mind if suggested a program for us? A picnic on the beach, rest on the rocks in the sun till nearly sundown. Then we'd come back up here revitalized for whatever the lovely evening had to offer. Mrs. Goforth. What do you think it would have to offer? Chris. Dinner on the terrace with the sea still booming? How is that for a program? Say, with music, a couple of tarantella dancers brought up from the village, and Rudy appears on the terrace. Rudy. Mrs. Goforth, I've taken care of that for you. They're going. On the way out. Mrs. Goforth. No trouble? Rudy. Oh, yeah, sure. They want to see the Signora. Mrs. Goforth. No. I won't see them. But they are appearing upstage. The members of her kitchen staff who have been discharged. Here they come. Hold them back. She staggers up, turns her back on them. They cry out to her in Italian. Rudy rushes upstage and herds them violently off. A wave crashes. Chris, quietly. Boom. What was there? Mrs. Goforth. What? Chris. Transgression. Mrs. Goforth. They'd been robbing me blind. He caught them at it. We had an inventory and discovered that they'd been robbing me blind like I was blind. Chris, his back to her, speaking as if to himself. When a wave breaks down there, it looks as delicate as a white lace fan. But I bet if it hit you, it would knock you against the rocks and break your bones. Mrs. Goforth. What? Chris. I said it's so wonderful here after yesterday in Naples. Mrs. Goforth. What was wrong with yesterday in Naples? Were you picked up for vagrancy in Naples? Chris. I wasn't picked up for anything in Naples. Mrs. Goforth. That's worse than being picked up for vagrancy, baby. She chuckles. He grins agreeably. Chris. Mrs. Goforth, I'm going to tell you the truth. Mrs. Goforth. The truth is all you could tell me that I'd believe. So tell me the truth, Mr. Flanders. Chris. I'll go back a little further than Naples, Mrs. Goforth. I'd drawn out all my savings to come over here this summer on a Yugoslavian freighter that landed at Genoa. Mrs. Goforth. You're leading up to financial troubles, aren't you? Chris. Not so much that as something harder, much harder, for me to deal with. A state of, well, let me put it this way. Everybody has a sense of reality, of some kind or other, some kind of sense of things being real or not real in his particular world. Mrs. Goforth, I know what you mean. Go on. Chris, I've lost it lately. This sense of reality in my particular world. We don't all live in the same world, Mrs. Goforth. Oh, we all see the same things. Sea, sun, sky, human faces and inhuman faces, but they're different in here. Touches forehead. And one person's sense of reality can be another person's sense of, well, of madness, chaos, and Mrs. Goforth. Go on. I'm still with you. Chris. And when one person's sense of reality or loss of sense of reality disturbs another one's sense of reality, I know how mixed up this Mrs. Goforth. Not a bit. Clear as a bell. So keep on. You haven't lost my attention. Chris. Being able to talk. Wonderful. When one person's sense of reality seems too disturbingly different from another person's, Mrs. Goforth. Sense of reality. Continue. Chris. Well, he's avoided. Not welcome. It's that simple. And yesterday in Naples, I suddenly realized that I was in that situation. He turns to the booming sea and says, boom. I found out that I was now a leper. Mrs. Goldforth. Leopard? Chris. Leper. Boom. She ignores the boom. Yes. You see, they hang labels. Tags of false identification on people that disturb their own sense of reality too much. Like the bells that used to be hung on the necks of lepers. Boom. The lady I'd come over to visit, who lives in a castle on the top of Ravello, sent me a wire to Naples. I walked to Naples on foot to pick it up, and picked it up at American Express in Naples. And what it said was, not yet, not ready for you, dear angel of death. She regards him a bit uncomfortably. He smiles very warmly at her. She relaxes. Mrs. Goforth. Ridiculous. Chris. Yes. And inconvenience inside. Mrs. Goforth. Invested all your remaining capital in this standing invitation that had stopped standing? Collapsed? Ho ho ho. Chris. Yes. Mrs. Goforth. Who's this bitch at Ravello? Chris. I'd rather forget her name now. Mrs. Goforth. But you see, you young people, well, you reasonably young people who used to be younger, you get in the habit of being sort of professional house guests. And as you get a bit older, and who doesn't get a bit older, some more than just a bit older, you're still professional house guests. And Chris, yes. Mrs. Goforth. Oh, you have charm, all of you. You still have your good looks and charm, and you all do something creative, such as writing, but not writing, and painting, but not painting. And that goes fine for a time, but Chris, you've made your point, Mrs. Goforth. Mrs. Goforth. No, not yet, quite yet. Your case is special. You've gotten a special nickname, dear angel of death. And it's lucky for you I couldn't be less superstitious. Deliberately walk under ladders. Think a black cat's as lucky as a white cat. Am only against the human cats of this world, of which there's no small number. So, what are you looking around for, Angel of Death, as they call you? Chris. I would love to have some buttered toast with my coffee. Mrs. Goforth. Oh, no toast with my coffee. Buttered, unbuttered. No toast. For breakfast, I have only black coffee. Anything solid takes the edge off my energy, and it's the time after breakfast when I do my best work. Chris, what are you working on? Mrs. Goforth, my memories, my memoirs, night and day to meet the publisher's deadlines. The pressure has brought on a sort of nervous breakdown, and I'm enjoying every minute of it because it has taken the form of me making me absolutely frank and honest with people. No more pretenses. Although I was always frank and honest with people, comparatively, but now much more so. No more pretenses at all. Chris, it's wonderful. Mrs. Goforth, what? Chris, that you and I have happened to meet at just this time, because I have reached the same point in my life as you say you have come to in yours. Mrs. Goforth, suspiciously, what? Which point? Chris, the point you mentioned. The point of no more pretenses. Mrs. Goforth, you say you've reached that point too? Chris nods, smiling warmly. The sound is skeptical, and so is the look she gives him. Chris, it's true. I have, Mrs. Goforth. Mrs. Goforth, I don't mean to call you a liar, or even a fantasist, but I don't see how you can afford to arrive at the point or of no more pretenses, Chris. Chris, I probably couldn't afford to arrive at that point any more than I could afford to travel this summer. Mrs. Goforth, I see. But you traveled. Chris, yes, mostly on foot, Mrs. Goforth, since Genoa. Mrs. Goforth, rising and walking near the balustrade. One of the reasons I took this place here is because it's supposed to be inaccessible except from the sea. Between here and the highway, there's just a goat path, hardly possible to get down, and I thought impossible to get up. Yes, well, but you got yourself up. Chris, pouring the last of the coffee. I had to get up it. Mrs. Goforth, turning back to him and sitting. Let's play the truth game. Do you know the truth game? Chris, yes, but I don't like it. I've always made excuses to get out of it when it's played at parties because I think the truth is too delicate and, dangerous a thing to be played with at parties, Mrs. Goforth. It's nitroglycerin. It has to be handled with the carefulest care, or somebody hurts somebody and gets hurt back, and the party turns to a devastating explosion. People crying, people screaming, people even fighting and throwing things at each other. I've seen it happen, and there's no truth in it that's true. Mrs. Goforth. But you say you've reached the same point that I have this summer, the point of no more pretenses. So why can't we play the truth game together, huh, Chris? Chris. Why don't we put it off till, say, after supper? Mrs. Goforth. You play it better on a full stomach, do you? Chris. Yes, you have to be physically fortified for it as well as morally fortified for it. Mrs. Goforth. And you'd like to stay for supper? You don't have any other engagement for supper? Chris. I have no engagements of any kind now, Mrs. Goforth. Mrs. Goforth. Well, I don't know about supper. Sometimes I don't want any. Chris. How about after... Mrs. Goforth. What? Chris. After lunch. Mrs. Goforth. Oh, sometimes I don't have lunch either. Chris. You're not on a healthful regime. You know, the spirit has to live in the body, and so you have to keep the body in a state of repair because it's the home of the spirit. Mrs. Goforth. Are you talking about your spirit and body, or mine? Chris. Yours. Mrs. Goforth. One long ago meeting between us, and you expect me to believe you care more about my spirit and body than your own, Mr. Flanders? Chris. Mrs. Goforth. Some people, most of them, get panicky when they're not cared for by somebody. But I get panicky when I have no one to care for. Mrs. Goforth. Oh, you seem to be setting yourself up as a saint of some kind. Chris. All I said is I need somebody to care for. I don't say that. He has finished his coffee and he crosses to the warmer for more. I'm playing the truth game with you. Caring for somebody gives me the sense of being sheltered, protected. Mrs. Goforth. Sheltered, protected. From what? Chris standing above her. Unreality. Lostness. Have you ever seen how two little animals sleep together? A pair of kittens or puppies? All day they seem so secure in the house of their master. But at night, when they sleep, they don't seem sure of their owner's true care for them. Then they draw close together. They curl up against, and now and then, if you watch them, you notice they nudge each other a little with their heads or their paws, exchange little signals between them. The signals mean, we're not in danger. Sleep. We're close. It's safe here. Their owner's house is never a sure protection, a reliable shelter. Everything going on in it is mysterious to them, and no matter how hard they try to please, how do they know if they please? They hear so many sounds, voices, and see so many things they can't comprehend. Oh, it's ever so much better than the pet shop window. But what's become of their mother? Who warmed them and sheltered them and fed them until they were snatched away from her for no reason they know? We're all of us living in a house we're not used to. A house full of voices, noises, objects, strange shadows, light that's even stranger. We can't understand. We bark and jump around and try to be pleasingly playful in this big, mysterious house, but in our hearts, we're all very frightened of it. Don't you think so? Then it gets to be dark. We're left alone with each other. We have to creep close to each other and give those little gentle nudges with our paws and our muzzles before we can slip into sleep and rest for the next day's playtime and the next day's mysteries. He lights a cigarette for her. The witch enters dramatically on the terrace. The witch. The next day's mysteries. Ecco, sono qui. Mrs. Goforth. With unconcealed displeasure. My lord, are you still here? The witch, as if amazed. Christopher! Flanders! Chris. How do you do, Mrs. Oh, I started to say Mrs. Ridgway, but that isn't it now, is it? The witch. What a back number you are. Chris, drawing away from her. Yes. Mrs. Goforth. How'd you miss your return trip to Capri last night? I thought you'd gone back there last night. I had the boatman waiting up for you last night. The witch. Oh, last night. What confusion. She puts down her hat and follows Chris. When was the last time I saw you? Mrs. Goforth. If you don't know, why should he? The witch. Oh, at the wedding banquet those Texas oil people gave me in Portofino. Oh, yes. You were staying with them and so depressed over the loss of... Chris, cutting in. Yes. He moves toward the balustrade. The witch. You'd taken such beautiful care of that poor old ridiculous woman, but couldn't save her. And oh, the old Duke of Parma did such a wicked thing to you. Poured champagne on your head and called you... What did he call you? Mrs. Goforth. Let him forget it, Connie. The witch gives her a glance and moves up to Chris. The witch. Something else awful happened. And you were involved in some way. But I can't remember the details. Chris. Yes, it's better forgotten. Mrs. Goforth is right. Some of the details are much better forgotten if you'll let me forget them. Mrs. Goforth rises and starts to go inside. The witch. Are you leaving us, Sissy? Mrs. Goforth. I'm going to phone the boathouse to make sure there's a boat ready for your trip back to Capri. Because I know you want back there as soon as possible, Connie. She goes to the library. The witch going to the table. Chris, you're not intending to stay here. Chris. Yes, if I'm invited, I would like to. The witch. Don't you know? Can't you tell? Poor Sissy's going. She's gone. The shock I got last night when I had to drink myself blind when I saw her condition. She comes closer to him. You don't want to be stuck here with a person in her appalling condition. You're young. Have fun. Oh, Chris, you've been foolish too long. The years you devoted to that old Ferguson bitch. And what did you get? Chris, lighting a cigarette. Get? The witch. Yes, get. She had you. You were had. Left you. Nothing. I bet. Or why would you be here? Chris. Please don't make me be rude. We don't understand each other, which is natural, but don't make me say things to you that I don't want to say. The witch. What can you say to me that I haven't heard said? Chris. Have you heard this said to your face about you? That you're the heart of a world that has no heart? The heartless world you live in? Has anyone said that to you, Mrs. Ridgway? The witch. Condotti. Marchesa Ridgway Condotti, Mr. Death Angel Flanders. Chris. Yes, we both have new titles. The witch, throwing back her head. Sally, Lori, Sissy. It's time for death, old girls. Betty bye. Less shrilly. Betty bye, old girls. The Death Angel's coming. No dreams. Chris. I'm sorry you forced me to say what I feel about you. The witch. Oh, that. My heart pumps blood that isn't my own blood. It's the blood of anonymous blood donors. And as for the world I live in, you know it as well as I know it. Come to Capri. It's a mountain, too. Chris, moving away. You're not afraid of the nickname I've been given? The witch. No. I think it's a joke that you take seriously, Chris. You've gotten too solemn. She follows him. Let me take that curse off you. Come to Capri and I'll give you a party, decorated with your mobiles, and... Mrs. Goforth to Blackie. See? She's out there putting the make on. Blackie leaves as Mrs. Goforth comes from the library toward the terrace. The witch to Chris. You're pale. You look anemic. You look famished. You need someone to put you back in the picture, the social swim. Capri? Mrs. Goforth on the terrace advances behind Chris and the witch. Mrs. Goforth. What picture? What swim? Capri? The witch. It's marvelous there this season. Mrs. Goforth. The sea is full of Medusas. Didn't you tell me the sea is full of Medusas and a giant one got you? The witch, crossing to her. Oh, they'll wash out. They'll be washed out by tomorrow. Mrs. Goforth. When are you going to wash out? I thought you'd washed out last night. I've ordered a boat to take you back to Capri. The witch. I can't go back to Capri in a dinner gown before sundown. She sits at the table and stares at Chris. Mrs. Goforth. Well, try my hot sulfur baths. Or just look the place over. It's worth it. It's worth looking over. Me, I'm about to start work, so I can't talk to you right now. She gets the witch's hat and brings it to her. I'm right on the edge of breaking through here today. I'm on a strict discipline, Connie, as I explained last night to you, and... She coughs, falls into her chair. The witch. Sissy, I don't like that cough. Mrs. Goforth. Hell, do you think I like it? Neuralgia. Nerves. Overwork. But I'm going to beat it. It isn't going to beat me, or it'll be the first thing that ever did beat me. The witch, rising and going to her. Be brave, Sissy. Mrs. Goforth. Leave me alone. Go, Connie. It'll do you in too. She fumbles for a tissue. The witch, looking wide-eyed at Chris and moving close to him. Watch out for each other. Chris, give her the Swami's book you translated. Ciao. She throws him a kiss and moves off, calling back. Questo è veramente una meraviglia. Ciao. Arrivederci, amici. The witch goes out of the lighted area and down the goat path. Chris goes to the table and sits, looking about. Mrs. Goforth. What are you looking for now? Chris. I was just looking for the cream and sugar. Mrs. Goforth. Never touch it. You want a saccharin tablet? Chris. Oh, no, thanks. I don't like the chemical taste. Mrs. Goforth. Coming to the table. Well, it's black coffee or else, I'm afraid, Mr. What? Chris? Chris. You have 3 villas here? Mrs. Goforth. 1 villa and 2 villinos. Villino means a small villa. I also have a little grass hut. Very Polynesian. Moving in front of the table. Down on my private beach, too. I have a special use for it and a funny name for it, too. Chris. Oh? Mrs. Goforth. Yes, I call it the oubliette. Ever heard of an oubliette? Chris. A place where people are put to be forgotten? Mrs. Goforth. That's right, Chris. You've had some education along that line. She returns to where he sits. Chris. Yes, quite a lot, Mrs. Goforth, especially lately. Mrs. Goforth. As for the use of it, well, I've been plagued by impostors lately the last few summers. The continent has been overrun by impostors of celebrities, writers, actors, and so forth. I mean, they arrive and say, like, I am Truman Capote. Well, they look a bit like him. So you are taken in by the announcement, I am Truman Capote. And you receive him cordially only to find out later it isn't the true Truman Capote. It's the false Truman Capote. Last summer, I had the false Truman Capote, and the year before that, I had the false Mary McCarthy. That's before I took to checking the passports of sudden visitors. Well, she moves to the opposite chair and sits facing him. As far as I know, they're still down there in that little grass hut on the beach. Undesirables are transferred to, when the villas are overcrowded, the oubliette, a medieval institution that I think personally was discarded too soon. It was a dungeon, where people were put for keeps to be forgotten. You say you know about it? Chris stares straight at her, not answering by word or gesture. His look is gentle, troubled. So that's what I call my little grass shack on the beach. I call it the oubliette, from the French verb oublier, which means to forget, to put away, and Chris, forget. Mrs. Goforth. And I do really forget him. Maybe you think I'm joking, but it's the truth. Can't stand to be made a patsy. Understand what I mean? He nods. This is nothing personal. You came with your book, picks up his book of poetry, with a photograph of you on it, which still looks like you, just, 10 years younger. But still unmistakably you. You're not the false Chris Flanders, I'm sure about that. Chris. Thank you. I try not to be. Mrs. Goforth. However, I don't keep up with the new personalities in the world of art like I used to. Too much a waste of vital energy, Chris. Of course, you're not exactly a new personality in it. Would you say so? Chris smiles and shakes his head slightly. You're almost a veteran in it. I said a veteran, I didn't say a has-been. She sneezes violently. Oh, I'm allergic to something around here. I haven't found out just what, but when I do, oh brother, watch it go. Chris, rising and bringing her a clean tissue. I hope it isn't the bougainvillea vines. Mrs. Goforth. No, it isn't the bougainvillea, but I'm having an allergy specialist flown down here from Rome to check me with every goddamn plant and animal on the place, and whatever it is has to go. Chris, have you tried breathing this seawater? Mrs. Goforth. Oh, you want to drown me. Chris, returning to his chair and sitting. No, I meant, have you tried snuffing it up in your nostrils to irrigate your nasal passages, Mrs. Goforth? It's sometimes a very effective treatment for Mrs. Goforth. Aside from this little allergy and a little neuralgia, sometimes more than a little, I'm a healthy woman. Know how I've kept in shape? My body the way it still is? Chris. Exercise? Mrs. Goforth. Yes. In bed. Plenty of it. Still going on. But there's this worship of youth in the States. This Whistler's mother complex. You know what I mean? This idea that at a certain age a woman ought to resign herself to being a sweet old thing in a rocker. Well, last weekend, a young man, came in my bedroom, and it wasn't too easy to get him out of it. I had to be very firm about it. Blackie appears on the terrace with a plate of food for Chris. Mrs. Goforth rises. What have you got there, Blackie? Blackie. Mr. Flanders' breakfast. I'm sure he would like some. Mrs. Goforth. Aw, now, isn't that thoughtful? Put it down there. As Blackie starts to put it down on the table, Mrs. Goforth indicates the serving table. I said down there. And get me my menthol inhaler and Kleenex. I have run out. Blackie sets the plate on the serving table and retires from the lighted area. Simonetta. Mrs. Goforth rings and hands the tray to Simonetta as she enters. Take this away. I can't stand the smell of food now. Simonetta goes out. Chris, who has moved toward the serving table and stands stunned. Mrs. Goforth, I feel that I must have disturbed you, annoyed you, disturbed you because He crosses back to the table. Mrs. Goforth, don't reach for a cigarette till I offer you one. Chris, may I have one, Mrs. Goforth? Mrs. Goforth, take one. Be my Trojan horse guest. Wait. She moves beside him. Kiss me for it. Chris doesn't move. Kiss me for it, I told you. Chris putting the cigarette away. Mrs. Goforth, there are moments for kisses and moments not for kisses. Mrs. Goforth, this is a not for kiss moment. He turns away and she follows and takes his arm. I've shocked you by my ferocity, have I? Sometimes I shock myself by it. They move together toward the balustrade. Look, a coin has two sides. On one side is an eagle, but on the other side is something else. Chris. Yes, something else. Usually some elderly potentate's profile. She laughs appreciatively at his riposte and touches his shoulder. He moves a step away from her. Mrs. Goforth. Why didn't you grab the plate and run off with it? Chris. Like a dog grabs a bone? Sure, why not? It might have pleased me to see you show some fight. Chris. I can fight if I have to, but the fighting style of dogs is not my style. Mrs. Goforth. Grab, fight, or go hungry. Nothing else works. Chris. How is it possible for a woman of your reputation as a patron of arts and artists to live up here with all this beauty about you and yet be Mrs. Goforth? A bitch? A swamp bitch? A devil? Oh, I see it. The view. But it makes me feel ugly this summer for some reason or other. Bitchy. A female devil. Chris. You'd like the view to be ugly to make you feel superior to it? Mrs. Goforth, turning to him. Why don't we sing that old church hymn? From Greenland's icy mountains to India's coral isle, everything is beautiful. Chris. Man alone is vile. Mrs. Goforth. Devils can be driven out of the heart by the touch of a hand on a hand, or a mouth on a mouth. Because, like Alex said once, evil isn't a person. Evil is a thing that comes sneaky snaking into the heart of a person and takes it over. A mean intruder. A squatter. Chris, may I touch your hand, please? Mrs. Goforth, as he does. Your hands turn cold. I've shocked the warm blood out of it. Let me rub it back in. Chris, your hand's cold too, Mrs. Goforth. Mrs. Goforth. Oh, that's just nervous tension. Never mind that. I'll tell you something, Chris. You came here at a time unusually favorable to you. Now we're going to talk turkey. At least I'm going to talk turkey. You can talk ducks and geese, but I'm going to talk turkey. Cold turkey. You've come here at a time when I'm restless, bored, and shocked by the news of deaths of three friends in the States. 1, 2, 3, like firecrackers going off, right together almost, like rat-a-tat-tat, blindfolded against the wall. Well, you see, She moves down to the lower terrace. I had a bad scare last winter. I was visiting relatives I'd set up on a grand estate on Long Island when some little psychosomatic symptom gave me a scare. They made a big deal of it, had me removed by a seaplane to the East River, where they had an ambulance waiting for me, and whisked me off to a... Know what I said when I was advised to go under the knife the next day? I'll tell you. Called my law firm and dictated a letter cutting them off with $1 apiece in my will. Chris, who has come down to her. Mrs. Goforth, are you still afraid of... He hesitates. Mrs. Goforth. Death? Never even think of it. She takes his arm and they move down to a bench and sit. Chris. Death is one moment, and a life is so many of them. Mrs. Goforth. 1,000,000,000 billion of them if you think in terms of a lifetime as rich as mine's been, Chris. Chris. Yes, life is something. Death's nothing. Mrs. Goforth. Nothing. Nothing. But nothing. I've had to refer to many deaths in my memoirs. Well, I don't think I'm immortal. I still go to sleep every night wondering if I'll wake up the next day. Coughs and gasps for breath. Face that angry old lion. Chris. Angry old. Mrs. Goforth. Lion. Chris. The sun? You think it's angry? Mrs. Goforth. Naturally, of course. Looking down on... Well, you know what it looks down on. Chris. It seems to accept and understand things today. Mrs. Goforth. It's just one big fireball that toughens the skin, including the skin of the heart. Chris. How lovely the evenings must be here when the fishing boats go out on the Gulf of Salerno with their little lamps shining. Mrs. Goforth. Well, they call this coast the Divina Costiera. That means the divine coast, you know. Chris. Yes, I know. I suppose... Mrs. Goforth. You suppose what? Chris. I suppose you dine on the terrace about the time the fishing boats go out with their little lamps and the stars come out of them. Mrs. Goforth. Firmament. Call it the firmament, not the sky. It's much more classy to call it the firmament, baby. How about spring? You write about spring and live in it. You write about love in the spring. Haven't you written love poems for susceptible patrons? Well, how many books of poems have you come out with? Chris. Just the one I brought you. Mrs. Goforth. You mean you burnt out as a poet? Chris. Pardon? Mrs. Goforth. You mean you burnt out as a poet? Chris laughs uncomfortably. Why are you laughing? I didn't say anything funny. Chris. I didn't know I was laughing. Excuse me, Mrs. Goforth, but you are very direct. Mrs. Goforth. Is that shocking? Chris. No. No, not really. In fact, I like that about you. Mrs. Goforth. But you gave that little embarrassed laugh, like I'd made you uncomfortable. Chris. My nerves are, Mrs. Goforth, gone through like your list of suckers. Mrs. Goforth sneezes and gets up to look for another tissue. Chris, standing. Mrs. Goforth, if you want me to go. Mrs. Goforth. That depends. Chris. What does it depend on? Mrs. Goforth. Frankly, I'm very lonely up here. Chris. I can understand that. Mrs. Goforth. Now, you're not stupid. You're attractive to me. You know that you are. You've deliberately set out to be attractive to me, and you are. So don't be a freeloader. Chris doesn't speak for a moment. Chris, gently. Mrs. Goforth, I think you've been exposed to the wrong kind of people, and Mrs. Goforth, cutting in. I'm sick of moral blackmail. You know what that is. People imposing on you by the old trick of making you feel it would be unkind of you not to permit them to do it. In their hearts, they despise you. So much they can't quite hide it. It pops out in sudden little remarks and looks they give you. Busting with malice. Because you have what they haven't. You know what some writer called that? A robust conscience. And the Viking spirit in life. Chris, going back on the terrace. Oh? Is that what he called it? Mrs. Goforth, following. He called it that, and I have it. I give away nothing. I sell and I buy in my life, and I've always wound up with a profit, one way or another. You came up that hill from the highway with an old book of poems that you got published 10 years ago, by playing on the terrible, desperate loneliness of a rich, old, broken-hipped woman, who all she could do was pretend that someone still loved her. Chris. You're talking about Mrs. Ferguson. Mrs. Goforth. Yes, I am. Chris, moving away from her. I made her walk again. She published my poems. Mrs. Goforth. How long after she published your poems did you let go of her arm so she fell on the deck of a steamship and her hip broke again? Chris. I didn't let her go. She broke away from me. Mrs. Goforth laughs uproariously. If you'll allow me to make a minor correction in the story, we were walking very slowly about the promenade deck of the Queen Mary 8 summers ago, more than a year after my poems were published. A young man called to her from a deck chair that we'd just passed, and she wheeled around and broke away from my hand, and slipped and fell, and her hip was broken again. Of course, some malicious friends blamed me, but I wouldn't leave her. Mrs. Goforth. No? She was still your meal ticket? Chris. Not at all. Mrs. Goforth. Who was? Chris, sitting. I was fashionable then. Mrs. Goforth. Do you sit down while a lady is standing? Chris, springing up with a rather ferocious smile. Sorry, won't you sit down? His tone is so commanding abruptly that she does sit down in the chair he jerks out for her. May I tell you something about yourself? It may seem presumptuous of me to tell you this, but I'm going to tell you this. You're suffering more than you need to. Mrs. Goforth. I am. Chris, cutting through her protest. You're suffering from the worst of all human maladies, of all afflictions. And I don't mean one of the body. I mean the thing people feel when they go from room to room for no reason. And then they go back from room to room for no reason, and then they go out for no reason, and come back in for no reason. Mrs. Goforth. You mean I'm alone here, don't you? Chris takes hold of her hand. She snatches it away from him. I'm working up here this summer. Working. Ever heard of it? A stage assistant appears in the wings as if she had shouted for him. He hands her a letter. This morning's mail brought me this. My London publisher's letter. Darling Flora, your book of memoirs, Facts and a Figure, will, in my opinion, rank with and possibly. She squints, unable to decipher the letter further. Chris removes it from her trembling jeweled hand and completes the reading. Chris, rank with and possibly even outrank the great Marcel Proust's Remembrance of Things Past as a social documentation of 2 continents in 3 decades. Mrs. Goforth. Well? Chris. A letter like this should fall on a higher mountain. Mrs. Goforth. Huh? Chris. A letter like this should be delivered above the snow line of an alpine peak because it's snow. Because it's snow. A snow job. She snatches it back from him. Mrs. Goforth, raging. For you? A blonde beatnik coming from Naples on foot up a goddamn goat path, wearing at this table a Japanese robe because dogs tore your breeches. I think your presumption is not excusable, mister. It lacks the excuse of much youth. You're not young enough for your money, or you're not young enough for your moxie. This publisher's not a lover. A lover might snow me, but this man's a business associate, and they don't snow you. Not me, not Sissy Goforth. They don't snow me. Snow me? They don't get up that early in the morning. Her agitation somehow touches him. His smile turns warm again. That they could snow me. The stage assistants lean, whispering together as they retire from the stage. Chris. Of course, without having your publisher's advantage of knowing facts and a figure. Mrs. Goforth. Nothing. Not a word of it. Chris. No, not. But what I was going to say was that I think you need companionship. Not just employees about you up here, but how often do you see old friends or new friends this summer, Mrs. Goforth? Often or not so often? Mrs. Goforth. How all I have to do is pick up a phone to crowd this mountain with. Chris. Crowds? Is it that easy this summer? You're proud. You don't want to ask people up here that might not come because they're pleasure seekers. Frantic choosers of silly little distractions and Mrs. Goforth. And what? Chris. Your condition. The terrible strain of your work makes you seem eccentric, disturbing. To those lower than sea level people. Mrs. Goforth. Get to whatever you're leading up to, will ya? Chris. I notice you have trouble reading. I've been told I have a good reading voice. Mrs. Goforth. Most human voices are very monotonous to me. Besides, I'm more interested in producing literature this summer than having it read to me. Chris. But you do need some agreeable companionship. Mrs. Goforth. Right you are about that. But how do I know your idea of agreeable companionship is the same as mine? You purr at me like a cat now, but a cat will purr at you one minute and scratch your eyes out the next. He leans back, smiling, working the sword up and down its scabbard. I think you better take off that old sword belt. Chris. There's no buttons on the robe, so without the belt on it. Mrs. Goforth. Take it off you. Chris. The robe? Mrs. Goforth. The sword belt. You grin and fiddle with the hilt, the sword, like you had evil intentions. Chris. Oh, you suspect I'm a possible assassin? Mrs. Goforth. Take it off. Give it here. Chris. All right. Formal surrender. Unconditional, nearly. He takes the sword belt off and hands it to her. Mrs. Goforth. Okay, Robert E. Lee, at Appomattox. She hurls the sword belt to the terrace tiles behind her. A stage assistant darts out of the wings to remove it. The other assistant laughs off stage. Chris. Now what can I use for a sash to keep things proper? Mrs. Goforth. See if this goes around you. If being proper is so important to you. She hands him a brilliant scarf she has been wearing about her throat. He turns upstage to tie the scarf about him. A phone is heard ringing offstage. Blackie appears from behind the library screen. Mrs. Goforth to Blackie. Who's calling? My broker again with the closing quotations? Blackie. The call's for Mr. Flanders. Chris. Me? For me? But who could know I'm up here? Mrs. Goforth. Cut the bull. You got a call up here last night. Business is picking up for you. Chris. This is mystifying. Blackie. The phone's in the library. Chris. Excuse me. He goes quickly behind the library screen. Mrs. Goforth crosses toward it but remains listening outside it. Chris, behind screen. Pronto, pronto. Madeline, how are you? How's your dear mother? Oh my god. I meant to come straight down there, but was it what they call peaceful? Pause. Oh, I'm so glad. I prayed so hard that it would be, and I'm so relieved that it was. I did so long to be with you, but had to stop on the way. And you? Will you be all right? Yes, I know, expected. But still, I could be some use in making the necessary arrangements. I'm at Flora Goforth's place. But if you could send a car to pick me up, I could. Oh? Oh? Well, Madeline, all I can say is accept it. Bless you. Goodbye. Accept it. Mrs. Goforth is shaken. She moves to the table as if she had received a personal shock. Chris comes back out. At the same moment, church bells ring in a village below the mountain. Chris, church bells in the village? Mrs. Goforth. Yes, appropriate, aren't they? Ringing right on a dead cue. Chris, I just received news that's shocked me. Mrs. Goforth. Another name you have to scratch off the list? Chris. Did you say list? Mrs. Goforth, smiling at him cunningly, fiercely. I went to a spiritualist once. She said to me, I hear many dead voices calling, Flora, Flora. I knew she was a fake then, since all my close friends called me Sissy. I said, tell them to mind their own business, play their gold harps and mind their own harp playing. Sissy Goforth's not ready to go forth yet, and won't go forth till she's ready. Chris extends a hand to her. The bells stop ringing. What are you reaching out for? Chris. Your hand, if I may, Mrs. Goforth. He has taken hold of it. Miss Goforth. Hold it, but don't squeeze it. The rings cut my fingers. Chris. I'm glad we've talked so frankly, so quickly today. The conversation we had at the ball at the Waldorf in 1950 was a long conversation, but not as deep as this one. Mrs. Goforth. Who said anything deep? I don't say anything deep in conversation. Not this summer. I save it for my memoirs. Did you say anything deep in your opinion? If you did, it escaped me. Escaped my notice completely. Oh, you've known Swamis. Excuse me, Swamis. You've been exposed to the intellectual scene and it's rubbed off on you a little. But only skin deep. As deep as your little blonde beard. Chris. Perhaps I used the wrong word. She places a cigarette in her mouth and waits for him to light it. He turns deliberately away from her and places a foot on the low balustrade facing seaward. This wine-dark sea, it's the oldest sea in the world. Know what I see down there? Mrs. Goforth. The sea? Chris. Yes. And a fleet of Roman triremes. Those galleys with 3 banks of oars rowed by slaves commanded by commanders headed for the conquests. Out for loot. Boom. Out for conquering, pillaging, and collecting more slaves. Boom. Here's where the whole show started. It's the oldest sea in the Western world, Mrs. Goldforth. This sea, called the Mediterranean Sea, which means the middle of the earth, was the cradle of life, not the grave, but the cradle of pagan and Christian civilizations, this sea, and its connecting river, that old water snake, the Nile. Mrs. Goforth, I've been on the Nile. No message. Couple of winters ago, I stayed at the Mina House, that hotel under the pyramids. I could see the pyramids, those big calcified fool's caps from my breakfast balcony. No message. Rode up to him on a camel so I could say I'd done the whole bit. Chris, no message? Mrs. Goforth, no message. Except you can get seasick on a camel. Yep, you can get mighty seasick on the hump of a camel. Went inside those old king-size tombstones. Chris, no message inside them either? Mrs. Goforth, no message. Except the pharaohs and their families had the idiotic idea they were going to wake up hungry and thirsty, and so provided themselves with breakfasts which had gone very stale and dry. And the pharaohs and families were still sound asleep, ho ho. He still has his back to her. She is obviously annoyed by his loss of attention. And if you look this way, you'll notice I've got a cigarette in my mouth and I'm waiting for you to light it. Didn't that old Sally Ferguson bitch teach you to light a cigarette for a lady? Chris, facing her. She wasn't a bitch, unless all old dying ladies are bitches. She was dying and scared to death of dying, which made her a little eccentric. He has picked up Mrs. Goforth's diamond-studded lighter. He holds her cigarette but doesn't return the lighter to the table. He tosses it in the palm of his hand. Mrs. Goforth, thanks. Now put it down. He sits down, smiling, on the low balustrade. There has occurred a marked change in his surface attitude toward her. The deferential air has gone completely. I meant my Bulgari lighter, not your backside. He studies the lighter as if to calculate its value. There is a pause. If you don't put that lighter back down on the table, I'm going to call for Rudy. You know Rudy. You've made his acquaintance, I think. Chris, if I don't put it down on the table but in my pocket, and if I were to run down the goat path with it, how fast can Rudy run? Mrs. Goforth, how fast can you run? Could you outrun the dogs? Yesterday you didn't outrun the dogs. Chris, that was uphill on the other side of your mountain. I think I could get down this side. Yes, by the funicular. I could operate it. Mrs. Goforth, can you outrun a bullet? Chris, oh, would you have Rudy shoot at me for this lighter? Mrs. Goforth, you bet I would. That's a very valuable lighter. Chris laughs and tosses the lighter on the table. Chris, On a parapet over the Western world's oldest sea, the lady that owns it had a gangster. Mrs. Goforth, the bodyguard of a syndicate gangster? Chris, yes. The lady that owns it had her bodyguard shoot down a, burnt-out poet who had confiscated a diamond-studded lighter because he was unfed and hungry. He'd been on a 5-day fast for non-secular reasons, and it had upset his reason. Mrs. Goforth rings the bell on the table. Chris seizes her hand and wrests the bell away from it. She rises from the table and... Rudy! Chris, louder than she. Rudy! Mrs. Goforth, you couldn't get away with it. Chris, oh yes I could, if I wanted. He tosses the bell back on the table with a mocking grin. Mrs. Goforth, what a peculiar, puzzlesome young man you are. You came out here like a dandy, kissed my hand, and now you're coming on like a young hood all of a sudden, and I don't like the change. It makes me nervous with you, and now I don't know if I want you around here or not. Or if I'm not superstitious. See? You've made me shaky. Chris, you didn't know I was teasing? Mrs. Goforth, no, you're too good at it. Chris, looking seaward, I see it, your oubliette on the beach. It looks attractive to me. Mrs. Goforth, help me into my bedroom. She tries to rise but falls back into the chair. It's time for my siesta. Chris, could I stay there a while? Mrs. Goforth, later maybe. Not now. I need to rest. Chris, I meant the grass hut on the beach, not your bedroom. Mrs. Goforth, be still. She's coming back out, my secretary, and I'm not sure I trust her. Chris, do you trust anybody? Mrs. Goforth, nobody human, just dogs. All except poodles. I never trusted a poodle. Blackie comes onto the terrace. In again, out again, Finnegan. What's it this time, Blackie? Blackie. Is it true you've discharged the kitchen staff again, Mrs. Goforth? Mrs. Goforth. Yes, it's true. Haven't you heard about the inventory? Blackie. What inventory? Inventory of what? Mrs. Goforth. I had an intuition that things were disappearing and had Rudy check my list of fabulous china. My Severins, my Limoges, my Lowestoft, against what was still on the mountain. Half of it gone, decimated. And my Medici silver, banquet silver used by the Medicis hundreds of years ago, gone. That's what the inventory disclosed. Blackie. Mrs. Goforth, is it possible you don't remember? Mrs. Goforth. What? Blackie. You had it removed to a storage house in Naples in an armored truck. Mrs. Goforth. Me? Blackie. You. Mrs. Goforth. Not true. Blackie. Mrs. Goforth, when people are very ill and taking drugs for it, they get confused. Their memories are confused. They get delusions. Mrs. Goforth. This mountain has been systematically pillaged. That's what the inventory. Blackie. An inventory made by the bodyguard of a syndicate gangster? Mrs. Goforth. How dare you suggest? I have a guest at the table. Blackie. I will always dare to say what I know to be true. Mrs. Goforth. Go in, find my checkbook, write out a check for yourself or whatever's coming to you, and bring it out here, and I'll sign it for cash at the Naples branch of my bank. You want it out? Now you got it. So take it. Take it. Blackie. Gladly. Gladly. Mrs. Goforth. Mutually gladly. Gladly. Go in. Blackie starts to go. Mrs. Goforth's shouting has brought on a coughing spasm. She covers her mouth with her hands and rushes in a crouched position toward the upstage area of the library. Chris. Boom. Blackie. Release. Chris, pointing at the terrace pavement. Blackie? Look. Blood. She's bleeding. Mrs. Goforth's voice offstage hoarsely. Dottore. Chiama il dottore. Julio Samonetta. Chris. You'd better go in there with her. Blackie. I can't yet. They'll get the doctor for her. She moves downstage, gasping. You see, she's made me inhuman. Simonetta explodes onto the forward stage. Simonetta. Signorina, la signorina è molto molto malata. Blackie, going toward her. Dove la signora? In camera da letto? Simonetta. No, nella biblioteca. Con il dottore. She sits on a bench and sobs hysterically. Blackie. Well, I'd better go in there. Chris. What shall I do? Anything? Blackie. Yes. Stay here. Don't go. Then to Simonetta, who is now crying theatrically. Ferma questa commedia. Simonetta stops crying and begins straightening up at the table. To Chris. Call the hospital in Rome, Salvatore Mundi, and ask for Dr. Rangucci. Tell him what's happening here and a nurse is needed at once. Then come in there, the library, and we'll... Julio rushes out onto the forestage. Julio. La signora. Goforth vuole vedere il signore presto, molto presto. Blackie to Chris. She's calling for you. I better go in first. Make the call and then come to the library. She goes out one way, Chris the other. Julio to Simonetta. She's dying. Simonetta. No one's been paid this week. Who will pay us if she dies today? Julio. Guarda. He shows her a gold bracelet. Simonetta snatches at it. Julio pockets it with a grin and starts off as she follows. The scene dims out.